Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Today is Friday, the 13th of November, and we have another session of Contemporary Culture series at the Harriman Institute in New York. My name is Lipovetsky. I'm professor of Russian Studies at the Department of Slavic Languages of Columbia University, and I'm very pleased and honored actually to run this session dedicated to the 80th anniversary of Dmitri Alexandrovich Prigov. We will be talking about Prigov today. We'll be reading his poetry, and please feel free to send your questions to all of us either via Q&A function if you are watching us through Zoom or through the chat on YouTube. And I'm very happy to introduce the participants of today's panel, who will be also, of course, the speakers, right? And this is Keti Chukhrov, a scholar and poet. Ainsley Morse, also a scholar and translator, including the translations of Prigov, and he's contributing translator to the book Soviet Text, from which we will be reading today. Aleksandr Skidan, critic, poet, and the author of the very important works on Prigov. One of them have been published by the Ugly Duckling Press as a separate brochure. Simon Schuchat, the translator of Prigov's Soviet text. You can see the cover behind him. And Matvei Yankelevich, the publisher, scholar, and poet himself, and he also represents the Ugly Duckling Press that has published the Soviet text by Prigov. I hope that at a certain point we will be joined, and that happens right away. So I literally invoked our next participant, Ilya Kukulin, a scholar from Moscow, and my dear co-author with whom we wrote a book about Dmitri Alexandrovich Prigov, which we hope will be published soon. Unfortunately, two other participants that have been announced couldn't join us for various reasons. Irina Prokohorova, probably the main publisher of Prigov since the 1990s, who has published several collected works of Prigov, have been publishing his prose and poetry while he was alive, and is doing a lot for his legacy after his death. And she cannot join because apparently due to the time change in the United States and lack of thereof in Russia, the time difference is too large and it's pretty late now in Moscow. And we are very grateful to those who could join us nevertheless. And Natalia Sharymova, a photographer and participant of the underground, cultural underground in the 70s. She also unfortunately couldn't join us due to health issues, but she sent us the message, and I hope that we will be able to show a little video recording that she that she did back in the late 80s when Prigov was visiting New York. So we are celebrating Prigov's birthday today, and actually, of course, some of you may know that Prigov's birthday was a week ago. It was on the 5th of November, but we decided that there will be plenty of activities in the virtual space, at least, that would be organized in Russia, and that's exactly what happened, and therefore our activity is sort of the continuation of the celebration, продолжение банкета. And we have a very I think, great group of experts and poets and publishers and we can talk about Prigov with them, and we can discuss. Actually, I asked everyone to think about just one, but I think very important question. What is the importance of Prigov, of what he has done for contemporary culture, both in Russia and globally, and what is the importance of Prigov for each of the panelists personally? So, since I'm the moderator, it is a special kind of envy, the moderator's envy to panelists, and therefore I would like to sort of to answer this question myself very briefly, and then give the floor to others and promise to keep mum after this. I have a small sort of video presentation, just a collection of various photographs of Prigov from different periods of his life, and certainly Prigov is a unique figure in the history of Russian culture, especially because he is the jack of all trades. He's not only a professional sculptor, visual artist, a very prominent poet, theorist. He's also the author of very important performances that he was running from the 1970s, and a performing artist by himself, as many remember him. He is very important as the bridge between post-Soviet culture and post-Soviet, especially post-Soviet protest art and literature and cultural underground of the 1970s. Certainly, Prigov is closely connected with the circle of Moscow conceptualists, artists, and writers, and in many ways he had become the voice of that circle. He had become the embodiment of aesthetic program that this circle has developed through its discussion, in which Prigov participated quite eloquently. But at the same time, his achievements are indeed unique, as I already said, and there is something in what he has done that goes beyond conceptualism and remains quite important for, as I said, today cultural practices. So I mentioned that Ilya Kukulin died. We just finished a book about Prigov, and while analyzing Prigov's texts, mainly texts, poetic, prosaic, theoretical, we realized that in his works, in his various forms that he practiced, he created his own quite original and sometimes homemade version of what we call contemporary theory. He introduced the contemporary vision of the subject. He introduced the contemporary understanding of culture that is not reducible to the concrete work of art. He introduced the concept of performatism not only as the aesthetic practice, but also as the cultural practice, as a certain philosophy of living and being. And that's exactly what has been picked up by contemporary artists. Quite notably, the last act into which he was involved was the joint performance with the future group Vaina. As we remember, that was supposed to be one of their first actions, one of their first performances. As probably many of you know, they were supposed to lift Prigov sitting in the big wardrobe to the, I don't remember, 20th floor of the dorm of the Moscow State University, while Prigov would be reciting poems from the inside, some kind of the ironic version of the cult of the poet in contemporary culture. However, this didn't happen, and Prigov had his last heart attack on the way to one of the rehearsals of this action, and Vaina made their one of their first performances dedicated to Prigov's memory, and it was called Feast, and it was basically the morning of Prigov in the Moscow subway. So let me now turn the floor to our guests, and let's talk about Prigov with them. So I've done my introduction and promise to be a very polite moderator from now on. And I would like to begin with Matvei Yankelevich, as I already said, the scholar, poet, translator, and publisher of the Ugly Duckling Press, the press that recently has produced a beautiful book of Prigov's text in English translation. So, Matvei, what would you say about Prigov's importance for culture today and for you in person?
I would just like to maybe preface any short remarks. I'll leave most of it to our specialists, but I am very happy for this book to be out. In a way, it's a journey that's many years in the making. In a personal way, Prigov was a completely novel discovery for me as a young person, or reading contemporary Russian poetry, but also reading the Oberyu writers who I was translating since the 90s. And around that time, I also found out about Prigov's work when I was in my 20s, and never thought that I would have the chance to work with him. But I did actually help bring Prigov to my university, Wesleyan University, and made some flyers for that event. He read at Wesleyan in around 94, so that was my first meeting with him. Then I had a chance to record him reading in Moscow in the late 90s, and then in the early days of this series, the Eastern European Poets series at Ugly Duckling Press, we published, in fact, in 2004, it was the 5th book in the series, Dmitri Prigov's 50 Drops of Blood, with some of the drawings from that series, and we're hoping to reprint this book. It was a very small edition, and we had Prigov come to New York to do a number of events, and he stayed at my house for a week or so, which was a really kind of fascinating time for me as a young writer. Prigov's work straddled so many genres, as we'll hear about today, in terms of the literary work, but also in terms of the mediums he worked in. And I think he was even then in the events of that first book, for the first book in English, a kind of a mystery, or a kind of explosion in the context of American poetry. And at that time, actually, what began to be conceptualist writing of the 2000s was forming. So I have a feeling that Prigov, in a way, played a very interesting background role in the development of American conceptual poetics. Back in 2004, Charles Bernstein wrote a blurb for this book, and right away, the first sentence of which is, Dmitri Prigov reimagines the blood of the poet within a startling series of conceptual vignettes that reveal the structures of adjacency and the possibilities of combination. And this was a kind of poetics that was becoming actually quite sort of newly formulated and newly manifested in a lot of the early 21st century New York conceptualist poetry. So in a way, Prigov entered this contemporary American context at that very precise moment. before the book Notes on Conceptualisms by Rob Fitterman and Vanessa Place, which came out from UDP 5 years later, which formulated in some ways the concepts or precepts of American, you could say, second wave conceptual writing. So Prigov has had an interesting impact here, although I think still very underknown. His impact on Russian poetry seems to me to be epochal. There's just the same kind of transition in Pushkin's time that Pushkin kind of is in a way a key figure for. I think that is a similar kind of crux that we see with Prigov and the history of Soviet and Russian post-Soviet poetry. So I won't say much more, but many years later, after that book, after 50 Drops of Blood, which we hope to reprint, we've now published Soviet Texts, which is quite a thick collection of Prigov's work, very representative, I think, of both prose and poetry, thanks to the efforts of Simon Schuchat and Ainsley Morse. And also just now we've brought out Aleksandr Skidan's pamphlet text or essay, translated by Kevin Platt, called Golem Soveticus, which places Prigov in the context of Brecht and Warhol. Actually I'm going to post a link to information about the 80th birthday sale of these two books together. So you can acquire them at nearly half the price. So, okay. So you're welcome to check that out. And with that, I think I'll let some of our other panelists speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Matvei. And actually, I invite panelists not to be very polite, but to ask questions and interfere. And I would like to ask a follow-up question. So you compared Prigov to Pushkin, something that you who translated both Prigov and Pushkin would know better than anybody. But I can imagine how many people had jumped on their seats from this comparison. Could you please elaborate a little bit as we ask at the seminars?
I mean, I think it's a paradigmatic shift. I didn't think anyone would be surprised by it. In a sense, I can't think of any poet in the post-war period that suggested such a historical change in a perception of what the poem is and what it does socially, conceptually, but also in its connection with other art forms. It really is a completely different conception of the poet, and particularly of the figure of the poet, which is also something that Pushkin seems to be, at least not that he personally did this or it was a sort of historical zeitgeist, but that shifted in the sort of secularization that's happening in Pushkin's work, and the shift to a kind of vernacular Russian. So similarly, I think Prigov makes this sort of shift to vernacular speech, but in a new idea, kind of sort of conceptually conscious way that redirects the history of sort of poetry for Russian language work, and recasts the role of the poet in a very important way. I mean, you think of even his relationship to the crowd and with the way that he created textual works that then he would paste up in his environment in this sort of intervention into the public space. And even that, I think, is a very telling gesture of a kind of recapitulation of the role of the poet, and a very self-conscious social role. So maybe I'll stop there.
You shouldn't. Thank you. I hope that others would continue asking this question, and we already have some interaction with our audience, which is quite exciting. First of all, we can see that Andrei Prigov and Katya Gabel are in the audience. Hello, Andrei and Katya. We are very happy that you're watching us. Please send our warmest regards to Nadezhda Georgievna Burova, Prigov's widow, who is not well these days, but we wish her all health in the world and are very grateful to her. And we also have a question from Jesse Kanner, who reminds us actually that Irina Prokohorova, who should have participated in our roundtable, called Prigov several times Russians Dante, and which is also the role of a paradigmatic shifter, so to speak, the one who connects different cultural eras and transforms one era into another. If I remember Irina's argument correctly, she was saying that like Dante took Italian Vulgata and transformed it into the golden language of the Divine Comedy. Prigov took the language of the Soviet newspeak and transformed it into the material for the new kind of poetry. I'm just throwing some kind of fuel into this sort of fire of our discussion. Hopefully that will take off from here. And I would like to give the floor to Sasha Skidan. As you heard from Matvei's speech, his essay on Prigov, a very important essay in which he compares Prigov, or rather places him in between two other big names, between Brecht and Warhol, has been published as a pamphlet by Ugly Duckling Press, and it's a very beautiful book, I think. But certainly, Sasha has been writing about underground culture for his entire life, and he's a part of this culture himself, and so his reflections are quite important for us. So how would you answer our central question?
Thank you, Mark. I would suggest on a large cultural scale that Prigov introduced at least three very crucial insights which I want to discuss in small details right now. First of all, he invented a very paradoxical answer to one of the most crucial questions of the 20th century posed by Walter Benjamin. What is originality in the age of mechanical technical reproduction? How the originality is possible now, here and now? And Prigov's answer is following Andy Warhol's answer in the field of visual fine arts, but it's much more difficult to comprehend it in the field of poetry. And still, the answer is that the only originality possible in the age of mechanical reproduction is reproducibility as such, is reproduction and seriality. So more or less we are acquainted with this answer thanks to pop art and Andy Warhol. We kind of became familiar with the 90 Elvis Presley, 40 Marilyn Monroe's, 29 car crashes in the different colors, and so on and so forth. $90 bills, put one next to the other. But what is reproducibility and serial method when it comes to poetry? This is much more suspicious and much more questionable than in the visual arts, right? So I appreciate Prigov's answer, but it's not very easy to articulate. To give a hint, I would like to tell very briefly a short anecdote I just read in the Facebook. When several days ago there was a celebration of a great Russian philologist and theoretician of versification, Mikhail Leontievich Gasparov, and one of his pupils recalls his meeting with Gasparov and talking about Prigov. And Gasparov said, well, in the small portions, little quantities, Prigov is great, but in the big portions, it's awful. And here, I think, lies the main point of the my first point about Prigov. It was really paradigmatic shift that he introduced. Not the poem as such matters now as much as the serial or reproduction. But reproduction has two sides. And here I come to a second point of mine. Take, for example, early Prigov's poems. You will see that they're mostly good, but secondary. In comparison to Zabolotsky, Mandelstam, Akhmatova, he imitates certain devices, certain techniques. And he realized very early that he couldn't go beyond this imitation. So he changed the whole approach totally. And he started to imitate not particular poetics or a poet or technique, but the lifelong project of the poet, with certain references to not particular poet again, but to a style of an age, of a certain movement in the poetry, and this changed a lot. So he somewhat introduced an industrial revolution in the poetry. Like you can compare what he started to do with the imitation of these lifelong projects of poet from a big letter, by means of which he took a metaposition to any kind of discourse he was playing with. It's not about irony. It's not about parody, even in Yuri Tenyanov sense. It's something else. And you can comprehend it fully only in comparison to what Andy Warhol did in the visual arts by reproducing himself and the mass media icons of his time. And the third point I want to speak about is that Prigov produced a kind of a periodic table of discourse elements, which you can compare to Mendeleev periodic table of elements. And if you take even the empty squares of this table, you will immediately find out that those empty squares are potentially full of the already pre-existed forms, genres, and styles. So, in a way, Prigov fill the field of possible discourses, not just poetical discourses, not visual art discourses and practices, but involving religious, theoretical, philosophical discourses as well. And those empty spaces or squares in his periodical table of discourses are already potentially full of this other type of discourses. And this is something which no poet did in the previous times, except for Prigov. This is his most great achievement in my view. These three points. On a more personal level, I think that I think that the better way to say what Prigov was for me as a poet and as a human being will be to read a small fragment of my poem dedicated to him.
Yes,
Both
please. I want to ask you about that.
Russian and in English translation by Rebecca Bella. Пригов, Пригов, не допрыгав, ты покинул край родной, дверь в поэзию закрыта и поставлен часовой, часовой навек любимый, где найти еще такой? Он постовой, он тот же гений, поступок ростом в шар земной. Вот Пригов, он земной, но и небесный. Нам голос пел его прелестный, а ему был голос совсем не прелестный, а прельщающий. И вот он отозвался на этот голос, и теперь он с теми, кто бросил землю. Prigov, Prigov, didn't lift off. You left behind your native land. The door to poetry is shut, and the century takes his stand. The century loved forevermore. Where will we find another such? He was a patrolman, a genius too. His actions equaled planet Earth. Behold, Prigov, like the earth, yet from heavens. His voice sang to us enchanted, though the voice didn't enchant him, but invited, and he answered. Behold, he is now among the ones who abandoned earth. Second fragment. Субъектность Пригов превозмог. Он превзошел в себе субъекта и стал как бы всесильный бог деталей в тотальности поэтического проекта. Метапозицию он занял. Он имиджи кругом расставил. Смерть автора он жить заставил. Он Пригова Дмитрия Александровича, Беляевского академика, восславил. И Рубинштейна он восславил, и Кабакова он восславил, и Монастырского восславил, и Звездочетова восславил, и Пивоварова восславил, и Пиперштейна он восславил, и Гройса чуточку прославил, и многих он ославил. А вот Гондлевского он переставил, и Седокову переставил, и Некрасова Всеволода переставил, и Хармса, может быть, обставил, и уважать себя заставил, потому что встал по отношению к себе в метапозицию, метапоэтическую. Subjectivity was something Prigov overcame. He excelled beyond the subject and became an almighty god of detail in the totality of the poetic project. He took a metaposition. He placed images around him, made the death of the author living, and praised Prigov Dmitri Alexandrovich, the Belyaev academician. And Rubinstein he praised, and Kabakov he praised, and Monastyrsky he praised, and Zvezdochetov he praised, and Pivovarov he praised, and Pipperstein he praised, and Groys he praised a little, and many he praised, and many he dispraised, while Gandlevsky he rearranged, and Sedokova rearranged, and Vsevolod Nekrasov rearranged, and Harms perhaps outplayed and made them venerate him because he took in relation to himself a metapoetical metaposition. На этом я заканчиваю. This is the end of it.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you. That was wonderful and analytically and of course poetically. And those who are not as familiar with Prigov's works as you are probably didn't catch that both poems are reproducing the structure of his poems, especially the second one is written sort of upon the rhythmical and structural scheme of Prigov's famous Kulikova field. But may I ask you the question that once Sergei Butman asked Prigov himself, when Prigov was developing his concept that you so brilliantly presented about the new kind of authorship that manipulates by discourses rather than identifies with either of them or any of them, right? And by this means holds a metaposition. Butman, when that was happening at the Echo Moskvy interview, asked Prigov, but why then it is possible to identify your poetry by two lines? So if this is all a theater of discourses, why this theater bears the stamp of your personality, of his personality? How would you respond to this?
I think that travesty and metaposition doesn't necessarily exclude personality.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that personality in the post-war, post-modern world became something much more complex, multi-leveled, multifaceted structure, which you couldn't simply represent by two lines anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Prigov again, he's beyond this framework of personality or discourse, theater,
Mm-hmm.
poetry, visual arts. It's a complexity of flying through all these positions without fixing yourself in one of them exclusively.
Mm-hmm. What he called shimmering, мерцание, right? Jumping from one position to another, constant movement, constant process, right? But also that probably suggests that metaposition can bear the stamp of individuality as well. There are multiple metapositions, right? And Prigov created his own and by his own methods. I would like Keti Chukhrov to continue the conversation as an expert in performativity and as the author of plays in verse. She might add some new angles to this conversation. So Keti, please, what is your answer to our question?
Mark, I'm greeting everyone from Belayeva and Dmitri Alexandrovich.
Yes.
Blocks away from here. So, and I feel real humility because I'm in the presence of true researchers, which I'm not and have never been in terms of researching Prigov's heritage. Well, if I were to say what is crucial for me in Dmitri Alexandrovich's work, it is, of course, the courage to step out of literature, not because his achievement in literature and in versification could be doubted, but because he very poignantly understood that literature and poetry were losing symbolic importance and symbolic impact. And exactly at that moment, he made a gesture different from other literary workers and poets to somehow occupy this metaposition that you already emphasized and this theoretical direction that he has taken that you also emphasized. And I would put the outline about his method maybe into 5 dimensions which are important for me. Well, first of all, his conceptualization, which enabled him to step out from this literary tradition of Russian poetry, the lyrical hero, and this is a commonplace thing that everyone knows. Another thing is philosophic gnoseology. I haven't come across an artist or a poet well, after Second World War, which had such hunger, such Faustian hunger for knowledge and for expanding this cognitive scale. I think that if you take another conceptual artist which had lots of literary works, but which were labeling themselves as artists, this was also a very common thing, and which was a very systematic thing, like Lederman, like medical hermeneutics, Epperstein, Monastyrsky, Kabakov. They all had this obsession with philosophic cognition and philosophic gnoseology, claiming that the conceptual and gnoseological element and this philosophic dimension is much more important than this gourmet element of pleasure, of poetic pleasure, when you're feeling this oral pleasure of almost chewing these words. And this you have in contemporary Russian poetry, in Akhmeism, in Brodsky. Very few Russian poets are free from this gourmet oral narcissism. And Prokop is among them, along with maybe Vidensky or Hlebnikov. And second plane of importance is, of course, ideology and Soviet state, which is very much, of course, connected with the previous one, this gnoseological hunger, because, well, I remember in this connection the parallel with the Palace of Projects. If you know this work by Ilya Kabakov, it is in Zollverein near Essen, and it is a huge palace which provides an enormous amount of creative opportunities. Sasha mentioned this empty spaces, creative opportunities of doing whatever. You can paint, you can make drawing, you can make poetry, you can dance, you can perform. So this is some kind of thesaurus of creative universe, which the Soviet Union on the one hand never was, but at the same time it was. Probably this is the dream of the Soviet cultural subject about the world culture, about the incommensurable richness of the world culture, to which he is the, well, conceptual participant. And this immediately connects us, this ideological scale and the scale of the state, which was important for all conceptualists, to the notion of culture. And this I want to emphasize very much, the notion of culture, because Royce in his article, I forgot the title, Smert, it's from 79, Культура и смерть в городе Москве.
В городе Москве.
Yes, he emphasizes the impact of culture in the work of Prigov and the achievement of Prigov precisely due to the understanding of cultural scale. And Royce is not the only one who understands why culture is so important for an artist and for a poet who often discard culture and want to be these ex nihilo modernist creators, which Prigov never was. And he claims this is because culture is bigger than personality, and culture is before the personality. And understanding of this huge scale of culture makes and enables the poet to get away from triviality. So instead of just being trivial, when you are within culture, you have the chance to get away from triviality when you remain in this huge scale of cultural paradigms. Of course, it's not the question of paying tribute when you are within culture, but it's the again this obsession with the gnoseology, this Faustian element, which makes the poetic thinking and the cognitive thinking spin. And the fourth element is, of course, theology and cosmology, and I don't have enough research tools to talk about this, but this big eye that you can discern in visual works and installations, in poetic works, which is constantly haunting all the works of Prigov, it's everywhere. And of course, this is very important. And fifth, of course, you mentioned display and performativity, which was probably emerging in his work so proliferously after the Soviet Union, when the cognitive and conceptual games were less important and the body language became more important in the open platform of this competition of artistic behavior. And I would say that this play manifests itself not in morphology and not in semantics as we see in Vidiansky, because Vidiansky is also famous for his playfulness, which organizes as nonsense, but with something that Sasha Skidan wrote about in his text, logical machines, the machines of logical clarification and logical precision and logical puns. I think he was an incredible master of performative organization of logical gimmick and logical pun. And in this, of course, on the one hand, we see a poet which shows his virtuoso skills in poetic writing, but first and foremost, the clarity which he manifests, of course, belongs to a conceptual thinker and a conceptual paradox. So I would stop here and yeah.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much. It is curious that you emphasized Prigov's gnoseological hunger, as you put it, and his Faustian spirit. And recently, Ilya Kukulin, the Moscow-based critic, also sort of compared Prigov with a Faustian figure. Igor Kukulin, that's exactly what I said. Igor Kukulin, right? Compared Prigov with Faust, who sort of is never happy with the moment to capture, and therefore sort of his whole production is based on this sort of insatiability, philosophical rather than existential. But I was surprised when you said, surprised and at the same time agreed, but when you said that he gets away of triviality, because he gets away of triviality by mounting heaps of trivialities.
Yes, yes.
How do you resolve this paradox?
But you know, this type of triviality is not a literary triviality. It's a triviality of a ready-made. It's a ready-made of conceptual art which uses tautology, and tautology is not triviality. So in terms of logical machine, it's very important to differentiate tautology from a commonplace triviality. You know, commonplace triviality is to be original. When you are original and you are expressing your love and you are very emotional, so this is triviality. But when you deliberately use the tautology to be trivial, it's not a triviality anymore, but it's a ready-made.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. I would like to ask Ilya Kukulin to continue, because he already, I can see, is ready to join the conversation more actively. Ilya, please turn on your sound, please.
Just a moment. Sorry. I beg to dedicate my short paper to the memory of the artist Ivan Chuikov, the friend of Dmitri Prigov, who died, Ivan Chuikov died 2 days ago in Germany. Now it's worth mentioning why and in what perspective can we speak of a meaning of Prigov's work in today's Russian and maybe global context. Many critics were writing before and just after 1991 that the Moscow conceptualism is based on, first of all, mocking the Soviet discourses and symbols. Even as a sensitive person, as late Alexei Parshikov expressed the resembling viewpoint in his MA thesis defended at Stanford in 1993. Conceptualism notwithstanding, survived the Soviet period, but now it's more or less completed as an artistic project or as an artistic paradigm. Eventually it dissolved in culture or was finished somehow as a normative strategy or as an analog of mainstream style, maybe in post-unofficial literature. Post-unofficial culture. However, the conceptualists, for the most part, survived in another manner. Their being alive or not, but their aesthetic projects now can be perceived as open to the future. Prigov's project, Rubinstein's project, Chaikov's project. Why? It would be too simple to merely say that the Soviet order is returning now on a new turn of historical spiral, sorry for this Hegelian image, and thus that is a reason why conceptualist heritage is alive again. But to acknowledge this means to agree that Moscow conceptualism was only an effective way to be ironical in the context of Soviet, or at least in the context of authoritarian rule. I think that this is not true. Now we know that Prigov's works are quite popular, as strange as it may seem, among the Russian intellectual teenagers and among the students, including the students of contemporary art who study media art, digital art, and other very contemporary things. Why Prigov? I beg to propose another hypothesis explaining why the works of conceptualists now seem to be open to the future. The best of these works were and are inventing the new ways of artistic critique of today's consciousness, subjected to media images and common narratives, also widespread with media. They can be called, in many cases, Prigov's works today can be called semantic snapshots of the current moment, and they teach of the current then, but now they teach how to make the snapshots of one's own consciousness today. The artist and poet Darya Sirenko says that when she was reading Prigov's works in her students' years, those poems seemed her resembling the internet memes. I agree, they really do resemble, but in a specific sense. A good meme, every good meme, provokes thinking and allows to discover funny and strange sides of my or one's own thought. Prigov's poems function in an analogous way, but this is only one of their levels. Prigov gives us a lesson of a dialogical relations, dialogical attitudes too, with ready and steady discourses of settling within these discourses. Reading Prigov's works, one can experience sympathy with an ideologized and recognizable consciousness, recognizable image of ideologized consciousness, and at the same time to see the ideological science as half transparent, allowing to see fantastic landscapes behind them. Here I will quote the two fragments from the cycle von Stirlitz theme in Pyotr Tchaikovsky ballet, The Swan Lake, written in 1994. It juxtaposes the two images, the image of the white swan. I beg to remind that the Bolshoi Ballet was one of the main officially supported representations of the USSR, the Soviet way of life and Soviet high culture abroad, and the image of von Stirlitz, a Nazi officer from the Soviet famous series, The 17 Moments of Spring. That this image was, as Mark keenly observed in his essay, an embodiment of the late Soviet desire to emigrate within within one's body, to emigrate inside one's brain, to have a moral alibi for conscience while fulfilling the usual everyday obligations of a loyal Soviet citizen. Now I will recite in Russian the two fragments from this cycle, the theme of von Stirlitz's theme in ballet, in Petr Tchaikovsky's ballet, this one like. Вот Штирлиц по ночам изучает в лупу структуру своего мундира и партитуру «Лебединого озера» и обнаруживает удивительное сходство, вплоть до личинок бабочек в порах обоих. Вот он вслушивается в звуки «Лебединого озера» и обнаруживает внутри никем до сих пор не замечаемый таинственный крик. These larvae of butterflies in pores and unheeded mysterious cry are located as if they were beyond any ideologically marked sign, especially in his perestroika and post-Soviet works, perestroika period, and so post-Soviet works. Prigov shows at the same time the alienated images of science, consciousness that got used to understand the world with the help, only with the help of this science, and the mysterious, frightening life beyond this science, partially resembling a view of the sky with the clouds beyond the ideologically marked letters on the pictures of Erich Bulatov. In his essay around conceptualism, Mikhail Eisenberg writes, I quote, Prigov's, this essay of, as far as I remember, 1993 or 94, Prigov's activity is not only manifold, but also multi-layered. Attitude to Prigov as an artist is hardly can be transferred to his position of an artistic ideologue. It is difficult to embrace with the single move both artistic enthusiasm of the former of an artist and aesthetical relativism of the latter. An artist and an ideologue in one person do apparently the opposite things. The ideologue, acting in cold blood, render hopelessness habitable, and the artist seeks jerkily for any exit from this hopelessness, and in process of rendering anything habitable, finds the ruptures and new opportunities. Thus, artistic accomplishments of Prigov are at the same time his ideological fails, end quote. I think that Prigov's artistic accomplishments were his ideological fails, maybe, but only when he was alive. But they were and they still remain also the face not only of one single ideologue, but of the fails of ideology, or to be more precise, of any ready worldview, pretending to give people a common, all-explaining language. And now, when such all-explaining languages around us threaten to colonize our minds every minute, Prigov is obviously necessary. Prigov's works are obviously necessary, not only as critic of these languages, but also as a way to be a visionary in our time, a visionary demonstrating that another reality, or even many realities, can be found beyond them. But at the same time, he proposes, Prigov, his works propose that we shouldn't be too seduced with these images of realities. They can exist, but we cannot state anything finalized about these realities. We can produce only the truth before the last truth, предпоследние истины, while producing our art, but this truth before the last truth, they can every moment inspire our imagination to jump beyond the sign. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ilya. Thank you so much. Wonderful paper, and willingly or not, I think it answers perfectly the question we received from Philip Matras. Let me read it. For me, Prigov's genius did not reside merely in his avant-garde stance, but how his avant-garde stance tapped into the deepest elemental human impulses toward poetic mythifying. At the risk of generalizing, he connected the shamanic magical foundation of art, the poetess figure of magical summoning, to postmodern means. He was not satirizing, ironizing, or performing per se, but entering into the phantasmic dream life of a society. I guess my question is, what does Prigov offer Russian society and world art today? But as I said, I think that Ilya answered this question very pointedly.
Maybe I would continue my paper in order to answer to Philip. I think that what Prigov can offer to today's Russian society, not to be enchanted with any myths. I think that Aleksandr Skidan is right while recalling Brecht while speaking of Prigov. I think that this Brecht-like existence on the border of a myth, the creation of myth and the existence of its border, yet I think that this is important for today Russian culture as a lesson to be critical to one's own creatures. I think that while criticizing today's Russian politics or today's Russian situation, cultural situation, it's very important to be at the same time the visionary, the utopia, to cultivate the skills of utopian thinking and to locate oneself on the border of this utopian thinking, not to be enchanted with it.
Yeah, exactly. So what Prigov called cultural vmenяемость, I don't know how to translate it into English, right? Cultural right-mindedness, right? So how would you translate it, colleagues?
Something like sobriety.
I was going to say decency.
Decency is more ethical.
It has more to do with understanding.
Intellectual decency, right?
Maybe,
so
yeah.
to speak, intellectual decency. Yeah, and this idea of penultimate truth rather than ultimate truth is also a form of intellectual decency, of course.
Yes.
Our next two speakers, thank you, Ilya, thank you so much. Our next two speakers are also translators, and their presence gives us a chance to read some Prigov literally, right? And both Simon and Ainsley, as I already said, contributed to the volume Soviet texts, which I think is the best homage to Prigov's birthday. On this side of the planet, on the other side of the planet, we have the small version of collected works published by NLO. So NLO now published two versions of Prigov's collected works. One is large, huge, which I curated, and 5 volumes, one of which we did together with Ilya, and there were quite a few people involved in this enormous project. And another one is a small collected works of Prigov, which presents Prigov's texts not by cycles, by books, as he wrote them, but by selected poems. And Lev Aborin had created this quite interesting collection. But on our side of the planet, we have Soviet texts, and now I want to give the floor to Simon Schuchat, who will read his translations of Prigov's, let's say, prose, although prose is a very tentative term in connection with Prigov's work.
Well, thank you, Mark, and I'm very honored to be here with everyone, and I'm also very grateful that Matvei and Ainsley and Mark also have helped make Soviet text a physical object in the world in this part of the universe. So I had a little bit of an answer to the question of what is the significance or the importance of Prigov today, which for me at least is his exuberance. And if you're translating him, if you're working closely with the text, this is just an incredible energy and joy in what he's doing. He's having a wonderful time, and I think that's a great value, and it's a value that I learned from, and I think that he projects it beautifully. When you're reading him, you sort of feel that he's about to start laughing, and he's holding back. But fortunately, we don't have to hold back when we're reading him. So the first things I'm going to read are, he did a cycle of 20 stories about Stalin. And this is in the late period of stagnation. So I'm going to read several of those. So things had gotten really bad for the people. One day Lenin came to Joseph Vissarionovich and said, "What is to be done?" Stalin looked straight at him, became very serious, and replied, "What is to be done? Just do it." One day Joseph Vissarionovich raised up the people and overthrew the Tsar. There was happiness. Grand Duke Constantine came to Stalin and said, "Make peace with us, and the world will be yours." Stalin looked straight at him, smiled wearily, and said, "We do not need the world. Russia will be enough for us." One day, Joseph Vissarionovich worked through the night and thought up a plan for defeating the fascist hordes. When he came home, they told him that his wife had died. Stalin looked straight at the corpse of his wife, became very serious, and replied, "A man is victorious on the grand scale, but life takes revenge on him through trivialities." One day, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Bukharin came to Joseph Vissarionovich and said, "It's time for you to go." Stalin opened the window. Outside, the people were shouting, "Stalin! Stalin!" Stalin looked straight at them, became very serious, and replied, "I will go to them, the people." And he went out of the Kremlin. Things had gotten really bad for the people. One day, representatives of the people came to Joseph Vissarionovich and said, "Come back. We have hung Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Bukharin." They were mistaken. Stalin looked straight at them, became very serious, and replied, "You shouldn't have hung them. How will they find out now that they were mistaken?" So during the Glasnost Perestroika period, Prigov revisited this, and he came up with another 7 news stories about Stalin. So things had gotten really bad for the people. They started rioting. The Tsar summoned Stalin and said, "Get the people to go out on Senate Square." Stalin brought the people out, but the gendarmes were there. They started shooting, and all the people were killed, more than 1 million. One day, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Bukharin came to Stalin and said, "You're mistaken. Let's have a talk." Stalin grabbed a gun off his desk and shot them on the spot and ordered that the bodies be buried immediately. One day, Stalin came to see Lenin and Gorky. He saw that there was no one around and cut Lenin down, and he buried the body without being seen. He went back to Moscow and said, "Lenin is dead. He left everything to me." One day, Stalin's wife came to see him and said, "Why did you take all the money away from that poor woman? That's not right." Stalin grabbed a gun off his desk and shot her on the spot and ordered that the body be buried immediately. One day, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev came to Stalin and said, "You're mistaken. Let's have a talk." Stalin grabbed a gun off his desk, but Khrushchev managed to shoot first and killed Stalin and ordered that the body be buried immediately. So you can see that you can see that Prigov was attuned to what was going on around him, whatever it was. And the next piece is from 1998, and it has a philosophical introduction, but I'm going to omit that. Those are reading them is one thing, but trying to listen to them may be a little different. But this is called Non-Spurious Transformations, and it's a written work, but you do get a feel of what his performances must have been like from reading this. If you take 2 tables and put them together and put a chair on top of them, you get a throne. If you take the throne, flip the table onto one side, and put a chair behind them, you get a machine gun nest. If you take the machine gun nest, put one table on top of the other, and throw out the chair, you get a pagoda. If you take the pagoda, turn one of the tables upside down and submerge it in water and throw out the other table, you get a flotation device. If you take the flotation device, remove the table from the water, stand it up normally, put the other table on top, hoist a bookcase on top of them, and attach a lamp on top, you get a lighthouse. If you take the lighthouse, throw out the two tables and the bookcase, take a bureau and put wheels under it, you get an armored car. If you take the armored car, get rid of the wheels, pull out the bureau drawers, stand them up vertically, and get rid of the bureau, you get a columbarium. If you take the columbarium, throw away the bureau drawers, take the chair and lay it on its back, put a stool behind it and turn on the fan, you get an airplane. If you take the airplane, stand the chair up normally, put another one on top, then a third, then a fourth, and as many as the height of the room allows, you'll get a descent into the mine. If you take the descent into the mine and topple it to the floor with a crash so that you end up with a pile of debris, you get the Spanish Armada after the Battle of Trafalgar. If you take the Spanish Armada, throw away the debris, stand up one of the surviving chairs normally and connect it to electricity, you get an electric chair. If you take the electric chair, throw away the actual chair, and let a large jolt of electricity run through the disconnected wires, having attached capacitors to them, you get lightning. If you take the lightning, take a person and touch them to one of the wires, you get a corpse. If you take the corpse, throw everything else away, bring in a bed, and put two opposite or same-sex beings in it, you get love. If you take love, get rid of the bed, attach wings to the back of the two beings, you get angels. If you take the angels, get rid of the beings, and substantially whittle down the wings, you get spirit. If you take the spirit, get rid of everything, and bring nothing in, then, in fact, nothing will be left. But whether there will be nothing, that is the question. So those were what I was going to.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. That's wonderful. That was wonderful. And the next speaker is Ainsley Morse, who will be reading her translations of Prigov's very famous poems. At first we thought that we'll do it in Russian and in English, but now we figured out that people probably know these poems anyway, and it would be more interesting, so more defamiliarizing to hear them in English. So Ainsley, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's an honor to go last, and I have a couple of things to say that are kind of jumping off of all the other things that have been said. And so I will try to connect the poems that I'm going to read with some of the things that have been said. So these are fairly early poems. They kind of predate some of the more grandiose examples of seriality that we have been talking about, but I think that they are very much caught up with this decreasing symbolic importance of poetry that Keti brought up. Another thing that came to mind when I think, Mark, you said that Prigov can be identified if you read two lines, right? But when I read these poems, these early 1970s poems, I actually sometimes mix him up with Limonov, right? Like with some of the Limonov, and so that's kind of an interesting. I mean, that's getting into maybe some questions of genealogy, but there are a couple poems that I persistently can't remember which one of them wrote. And another reason that I thought of for why you can recognize Prigov by just a couple of lines is that he wrote so much, right? Like, so this was part of his project. In some ways, this is why we recognize him, because he covered so much space with himself. And because these poems are from the 70s, it also reminds me of how much a poet like Yevtushenko wrote. Right, like somebody who, Guinness and Weil make fun of Yevtushenko. They say that he had a poem for every occasion, and Prigov kind of takes this impulse, right? And he has a poem for doing the dishes. He has many poems for doing the dishes, right? Or a poem for sweeping the floor. And this is another version of this deconstruction through repetition of these gigantic models that we have, right? And so I think, yes, Dante, Pushkin, we can make this comparison in terms of his function, but not the figure, of course. And Prigov is interested in the figure, right? So that's an important distinction. He's very interested in the figure of the poet. And so my very modest conclusion, which is sort of not even necessarily about today so much, but what did Prigov do? Did he make it so that there can't be a poet anymore, right? Like there just can't be. And that is relevant for today, because I think we could say that there are people who are still trying to be poets with a capital P. So just a couple of words about difficulty of translation, because these poems are simple, right? By definition, they're not doing really complex things with language like some of the other poets who've been mentioned in our discussion, but he's very hard to translate because so much of it is tone and idiom. And I think that's particularly relevant to the poems that I'm going to read, these early poems of the housekeeping. And so this is this specific kind of ventriloquism that he's doing that's immediately recognizable for people who occupied the same kind of linguistic social space. And part of what's interesting and part of what he does in the poem is that he fails at the ventriloquism at a certain important point. And so, but you need to be able to recognize who he's ventriloquizing. And since we don't have a perfect analog for this in English, I think this was, at least for me with these poems, this is one of the most difficult parts of translating. So one example, just before I start reading, so the cycle I'm going to be reading poems from is, we translate it as housekeeping. In Russian, it's домашнее хозяйство. And I think this is a wonderful example already of Prigov destabilizing the subject matter, because housekeeping is, in my view, a quite neutral phrase in English. In Russian, хозяйство is this, etymologically, it's related to хозяин, a master, right? And so there's this disconnect already between домашнее, domestic, something very small and feminine and local, and then this mastery of the хозяин. So you could even translate it as like domestic mastery or something. And this is, well, automatically is very funny for me. I'm picturing an American guy on a riding lawnmower, very, very proud, right? Master of his domain. And I feel like that's there immediately in the Russian in a way that housekeeping doesn't quite get it. Okay, so I'm going to dive right in with a banal rumination on the topic of freedom. Just when you've finished up the dishes, look, a whole new pile awaits. What kind of freedom is this? Just let me make it to old age. True, you could just not wash them, but then there's people coming by and saying, hey, the dishes are dirty. What kind of space for freedom here? Second poem about dishes. I've spent my whole life washing dishes and composing poems most sublime, and this has lent me all of my life's wisdom and made my temperament firm and mild. I watch the water flow and comprehend it. People and power stand below there on the ground. Whatever I don't like, I just annul it. And what I like is out there all around. There's some more dishes. I wrestle with domestic entropy as a source of energy divine. These forces, inglorious and blind, I overcome in quiet, unsung struggle. I'll wash the dishes 3 times a day, wash and scrub the floor all over. I'll build the meaning and structure of the world on this place that seems like it is empty. So you're starting to get a sense by now of this cycle. You have this speaker who is eminently domesticated, right? He's often explicitly emasculated. It's definitely a he, and he's doing a lot of dishes. But he is also imagining himself a master of poetry, of the universe, of philosophy. But I think that another way that this can be taken out of its 1970s Soviet context and given to us is that it reinforces in some ways the stability of this social paradigm, right? The way that even dissidence, as you're about to hear, dissidence has become part of the background noise, and philosophical questions have collapsed into themselves and become the kitchen table, right? So to continue, water flows from the tap, clean, transparent, and thick, and with 100 other qualities. And what follows from this? What follows is we must live on and sew our sundresses from calico. And we really don't want, go on, to be imprisoned for our views, but we must. And now we're going to leave the kitchen and go to the store. I scored some chuck strips in the meat store today and packed them with care to stay safe on the way. Went out from the counter, not even discreet, just lugging a huge chunk of black market meat. There lurched out a filthy, decrepit old hag. The chunk was enormous, it could only be dragged. Well, it'd be one thing if she worked at the store. Okay then, it's fair, she can take a bit more. But she was just random, and plus she was ugly. While me, I'm a poet, the pride of Russia, that's me. I spent half the day standing here among strangers, but happiness lives with these fucking malingerers. We're still in line. Those bastards kicked me, damn it, out of line, toot sweet. I was waiting to get grapes, thinking I'd have a little treat. Nasty women fell upon me, said I hadn't been in line. Well, I hadn't for the whole time, but I'd sure spent some time nearby. We're back in the kitchen now. The broom is broken, won't do its job. Nothing for me to sweep the floors. But once, gee willikers, how I once used to sweep. Then the way I used to sweep. Brightness would reign over all, but now everything's broken, won't do its job. I don't want to live. Little more optimistic. I'll fry a little cutlet, cook up a little broth, and put it down to rest a bit while I open up the window out to the courtyard and jump right in the sky and fly and fly and fly and then come back and eat some if I want to. This is the last poem I'll read. I'm a little bit dead tired, probably because I'm tired. I lived my life most tirelessly, but now for some reason I'm tired. Is this why I finally got tired? Or am I just tired of this? And after that, they sing those songs, like, in this country, we never get tired. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ainsley. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Wonderful translations, wonderful poetry, wonderful performance. And so the logic of our panel is sort of approaching Prigov, and the last gig that we have is actual reading of Prigov's poems by Prigov himself. And this is a gift from Natalia Sharymova, a journalist and artist and photographer. And since, as I said, she couldn't be with us today due to health reasons, she asked me to read a short preface to the excerpt from a larger video recording of Prigov. We will just show 5 minutes. But here are the circumstances of this recording from Natalia Sharymova. I met Dmitri Alexandrovich Prigov in New York in 1988 or 89. He stayed with journalist Vladimir Kozlovsky from Moscow. Somehow I found out about it, and somehow I knew who Dmitri Alexandrovich was. After all, I left Russia in 1976. I decided that it was to make a video of Prigov's performance, but no poetry readings by Dmitri Alexandrovich were planned. I really wanted to make this video. I called Kozlovsky, called Dmitri Alexandrovich to the phone, and offered to film his reading somewhere in a private flat to organize kvartirnik. He immediately agreed, didn't ask a single question. My friend Natalia Diakovskaya was supposed to shoot. My other friend, Lucrezia Maroni, maybe an Italian duchess, a descendant of a famous Renaissance portrait painter, did the interiors in New York. She had a space spacious loft in Soho, it was fine for my purposes. Lucrezia Maronis herself made furniture that combined the quality and value of the past with the contemporary mood. Her tables and chairs brought a smile. The interior details that were fashionable at that time looked just as humorous. The fake Persian carpets painted on the floor and walls painted with marble. It is difficult to imagine a better contrast between the whimsical interior in which we found ourselves and Dmitri Alexandrovich, a simple cultural work. It seems to me that these conceptual findings amused Dmitri Alexandrovich. He was in a great mood and read for about 40 minutes. From that day on, my friendship with him began. In New York, when I asked him about perestroika, he replied, "Somehow last year I was arrested and taken from the police station to a madhouse. If it hadn't been for perestroika, I would have spent 2 years there. And so in 2 days I was released," which happened actually in 1986. As far as I remember, then in 1988, Dmitry Alexandrovich said that the ideology of perestroika was at impasse in Soviet ideas or Russian ideas on a new round. And returning to them, in the opinion of Dmitry Alexandrovich, will give nothing. Dead end. As it happened, actually. Many years have passed since then, and only now, with the help of Lyubova Malышeva, I managed to publish this video on the internet. I present to your attention a fragment of the video. Thank you, Natalia Sharymova. So please bear with me. This video can be a little low on sound, but that's maximum that we can present, and it will be about 5 minutes, after which we'll move to questions. Okay, where are we?
Мальчик, мальчик, грамотей, пионер отличный, расскажи-ка мне скорей, что со мною станет? Он ответил: ты пойдешь, дяденька мой милый, подскользнешься и попадешь вон под тот автобус. Дождливый день, мы с тараканом сидим у мокрого стекла и вдаль глядим, где из тумана встает желанная страна, как некий запредельный дым. Я говорю с какой-то негой: что, волосатый, улетим? Я не могу, я только бегать умею. Ну, бегать. Вот молодежь на комсомольском съезде ликует и безумная поет, а дальше что? А дальше съезд пройдет, а там уже и старость на подъезде, а там и смерть, и в окружении сил Бог спросит справедливо и сурово: где ж был ты, друг? А я на съезде был, на 19-м, на съезде комсомола. Ты помнишь, как в детстве, Мария, мы жили в селении одном, со странным каким-то названием, уж и не припомню каким. Ты помнишь, гроза надвигалась, нет, это в смысле ином, а в сталинском и переносном тогда миновало уже. И были мы дети, Мария, коли угрожала нам смерть, то вот вовсе не по разнарядке, а в виде подарка как бы. Давно мы не дети, Мария, и жизнь на различный манер по-прежнему нам угрожает, а мы не боимся ее. Сейчас я чуть-чуть вспомню, пока выключить, я припомню, просто я не помню, что помню. Новый президент Соединенных Штатов, поруган старый президент Соединенных Штатов. А нам-то что? Ну, президент, ну, Соединенных Штатов. А интересно все же, президент Соединенных Штатов. Опять поляки метят на Москву, понять их можно, ведь столица мира. Сначала солидарность там и хунта, а после прямым ходом на Москву, как в 41-м. Но не оттягать теперь земель мысканьих российских. Нет, дорогой товарищ Юрзельский, Москвы вам покоренной не видать. Чтобы режим военный утвердить, то надо подключить канализацию, и ни одна не устоит цивилизованная нация, когда фекалии потекут вовне, ведь дух борьбы он гордый по природе, он задохнется в этом говне и полностью умрет в народе. Вдали Афганистан многострадальный, вблизи многострадальный мой народ. От одного многострадального к другому летит в виде подарка самолет. А в самолете воинские части, а в воинских частях сидит народ. Народ ведь он всегда ленив отчасти, не повезут, так сам не побежит. Ах ты, гадина такая, крысе, говорит Мария, бродит вокруг нее с поленом, крыса щелится, на стену прыгает прыжком опасным, падает, кричит ужасно, отпусти, не то я внуков и детей перекусаю. Ах ты, гадина Мария, в череп ей бревно бросает, крыса падает на землю и кричит, как поросенок. Ах ты, гадина такая, дети плачут сквозь просонок, крыса плачет, умирая. Чем больше Родину мы любим, тем меньше нравимся мы ей. Так я сказал в один из дней и до сих пор не передумал. Кацап поцапался с ЦК, цапон себе на путь ЦКу, да ЦК тут цыц ему цитаты, и он как Кацан в ЦК, но другого, менее значительного, такого маленького, как цаца какая-то ехала. Когда большая крокодила по улицам слона водила, то следом всякая мудила через неделю уж водила своего слоника. Когда вот в Калуге по случаю был, одну калужанку я там полюбил. Была в ней большая народная сила, меня на руках она часто носила. А что я москвич, я хрупок и мал, и вот что в сердцах я однажды сказал. Мужчина ведь мужественнее и сильнее быть должен, на то и остались с ней. Дай, Джим, на счастье плаху мне, такую плаху не видал я сроду, давай на нее полаем при луне, действительно замечательная плаха, а туда на счастье виселицу мне, виселицу тоже не видал я сроду, как много удивительных вещей на земле, как много замечательного народа.
I hope you could hear well. Could you? All right. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And let's move on to questions. And there are quite a few friends in the audience. Georgy Prigov, the grandson of Prigov, and John Hai has a question. Our old friend John Hai asks perhaps Sasha Skidan. Once in conversation with Prigov, I asked him about Mandelstam's assertion that he preferred the genitive, to which Prigov said in poetry, I am the nominative. Could you say a few words if time allows? So it can be John, it can be somebody, I'm sorry, it can be Sasha or it can be anybody else, but Sasha, the honor is yours.
Thank you, John, for the question. I believe it was a private joke from Prigov's, because what Mandelstam meant actually was something else than grammatical, pure, Mandelstam meant, I think, a particular grammatical structure to which he referred. With the sound?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Not always. Yeah, okay, go on.
I think it was a private joke which Dmitri Alexandrovich Prigov did in reference to Mandelstam's assertion of a particular grammatical case in the poetical structure. While Prigov, in his usual way, just used this to retour the whole meaning somewhere else. I think that by nominative he means something very different from grammar, because именительный падеж in Russian could means also not just the case in grammatical sense, but nomination of the or status of a personality, for example, in the social structure or in the political hierarchy. So I think that it was a pure joke, pure private joke, no, with no like actual underlyings. But of course, we can speculate on whether Prigov suggests by this something else.
Thank you,
But
Sasha.
it's a good example of Prigov's humor.
Yeah, a good example of Prigov's focus on what he called the central phantom, right? So the production of the central phantom by all means possible, which is at the same time central and non-existent as a phantom, right? So that's his main story probably. Let's move on to another question that we have from Aleksandr Boskovich. Thank you for a wonderful panel, colleagues. In his recent writings, Walter Benjamin writes about meta-paradigm. As a new paradigm, meta-narrative is not just another story, but another kind of story. This very much resonates with Prigov's work. For Benjamin, for example, the story called Art History is a meta-narrative in relation to Christian story. It is likely that the next paradigm, as Benjamin, will have many characteristics of the pre-modern world, something like modernity seen through medieval glasses. What kind of story our understanding of Prigov determines and articulates? What is that new paradigm? My question is, what kind of story your understanding of Prigov tells? So I think that's the question to all of us. Who would like to begin? Keti, maybe you, since you touched the gnosiological hunger. That's the question for you. We'll just chime in. Keti, do you hear us? Maybe not.
Yes, I do.
No?
I'm just scrolling the question.
It's in questions answers.
Well, I don't think I can. I exactly understood the point, but to touch upon this disciplinary issue that we bring forth when we talk about the meta character of history and the meta character of culture. I would like to emphasize maybe one paradox, which is very, very strange. Just try to pay attention that on the one hand, we all agree that Prigov was much more than a literary figure, but at the same time, he emanates this literary figure. He is the poet of a poet, even in Heideggerian sense, right? So why does this happen? How can it happen that he deserted the sphere of poetry and literary work, and he very often repeated that he does so, but at the same time he becomes the poet of poets, as Matvei mentioned. He can be the pseudo Pushkin of our time. I think this happens precisely because he steps out of the discipline. He steps out of literature and he bids farewell to the discipline, and he somehow emptifies it and leaves this space of poetry vacant. And only by the token of doing this very painful and traumatic gesture, he's able to reoccupy this space on new conditions. And this is really a very important thing that probably only he managed to do, because none of the conceptual artists, having written tons of literature like Pepperstein, they never occupied this position of big writers, right? And Sorokin had been writing a lot. He had been a conceptual writer, but he remained a conceptual writer and never became part of art. And Prigov, occupying this position of a conceptual artist, nevertheless managed to skip and to leap onto this position of Pushkin. This is a magic thing, actually, which is unbelievable. I think that this is precisely due to this incredible gnoseological depth and expanded scale. And at the same time, Groys has this wonderful thing that you have to see in your work what culture sees in you. You have to be what culture sees in you, not what you see in culture, but what culture has seen in you. And I think Prigov could be this mirror that was reflecting this huge scale of conceptual and artistic work. But what I wanted to answer also Ilya Kukulin's statement about conceptual art being over, I don't agree here. I think that it's not about Moscow conceptualism. I think that Prigov's conceptualism exceeds simply Moscow conceptualism, although he's part and parcel of it. But I think that generally artistic work, and you mentioned, Mark, this, that Prigov is more than an artist because he brought theory into art, theoretical gaze. And what is art? I mean, contemporary art is the only discipline and the only practice that is theoretical, that has this gaze of theory. So this conceptualizing tool is not simply part of historical conceptualism, but the tool of the discipline that knows how to emptify itself. And Prigov knew this tool, how to kill oneself and then resurrect again. So, well.
Okay, thank you, Keti. Somebody else wants to add something? So basically, do I understand you correctly that Groys was not just a slip of a tongue, and Prigov is creating his phantom version of Gesamtkunstwerk, as Evgeny Dobrenko once suggested already. So it's Gesamtkunstwerk in the negative dimension, and that relates to the entire culture rather than to a poetic tradition, and it's more close to contemporary art, as Prigov again admits many times that I'm a contemporary artist that is doing literature rather than a writer who is doing contemporary art. Do I understand correctly? Oh, Simon, please go ahead.
Just, I think that it somewhat relates to what Alexander had written in terms of relating Prigov to Warhol. Prigov looks around and he says, okay, what is a poet supposed to be? And he encompasses and absorbs everything which, in any particular context, someone would say this is what a poet is, or this is what an artist is. In the same way that Warhol said, okay, I'm going to be the great painter. I'm going to be the great visual artist. What does that entail, both internally, and what does it also entail socially or culturally or in your broader context? And I mean, when you go through, I really feel there's so much more of Prigov than I have read. But just with the little bit that I have read and translated, it's clear, okay, this is what a poet does, and that's what a poet does, and this other thing is something that a poet does, and I'm going to do all of them. You know, if I can see where it is or what it is, then I will fulfill that role.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Let me look at the questions, and we have comments rather than questions, and we have a comment from Galia Korovina. Hello, Galia, who reminds us Prigov's famous obituaries, which were ending with the text «Центральный комитет КПСС, Верховный Совет СССР, Советское правительство с глубоким прискорбием сообщают, что 30 июня 80-го года в городе Москва на 40-м году жизни, 40 years ago, проживает Пригов Дмитрий Александрович». Right, and so we can say that Prigov continues проживать on his 80th birthday as well, right? I think that's a good place to wrap up, to finish our panel, and I want to express my deepest gratitude to you all for spending time with us, to speaking about Prigov so brilliantly, especially those whose hour is close to 1 a.m. at this point. And much gratitude to our audience, to those who watched us through Zoom, through YouTube. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for listening. And thank you for your questions and comments. And Viva Prigov, happy birthday. All right. Okay, guys. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Спасибо вам, ребята.
Спасибо,
Очень
Саша.
хорошо.
Спасибо, Марк.
Саша, прекрасно, ребята, прекрасно.
Ага.
Очень хорошо.
Очень здорово.
У
Мы
меня
еще
тут просто-
надеемся,
Да.
надеемся в Глобусе сделать двуязычный такой вечер в марте. Больше как вот о Парщикове была программа, наверное, несколько часов, и по-русски, и кто хочет, и по-английски, так что будем
Чудесно.
там долго говорить.
Позовите Илью Кукулина, он же писал